Hello and welcome to the Property News Show, where each week we dissect and discuss the news from the UK property market with a focus on investors and landlords. This week we're covering the continuing trend for Londoners to want to live and commute outside of the capital and the effect that's having on the markets and prices. We discuss the first fall in 5 years of accidental landlords. We look at the causes of this, from increased regulation to tax changes and the impact that's having on the UK rental market. We touch on the controversy to do with leasehold, freehold and restrictive covenants, especially with new build properties, potential predatory practices and looking at who is responsible for this. Finally, we talk about the role that commercial to residential property conversions have to play in solving the UK housing crisis. This week, as always, I'm joined by Mark Comer, founder of the Progressive Group, property developer and host of the Mark My Words podcast. Dan Hulbert, a building consultant and host of the Property Vault networking event and podcast. And Michael Primrose, known as the property finance guy, specialising in building development finance, host of the Commercial Property Finance podcast and Progressive Property Network Bank. Thank you for tuning in. Please like and subscribe to keep up to date with these as we release them every single week. Leave your comments below on what you think of the news stories we've covered. Let's start the show. Our first story today is we have a story from Rightmove about more people wanting to move out of London and commute into London. As part of that story, it says that 23% of Londoners are saying they want to move out of London in the next year, and 59% of those say they want a sub 1 hour commute. Mark, what do you think that has to, has that got an effect on the market? What changes is that going to have?
Well, it definitely does have an effect on the market. I mean, Peterborough is a prime example. About 20-25% of this city now commute on a daily basis to London. House prices in Peterborough, I don't know, a 3-bed might be sort of 250, the sort of place that a Londoner may want to live. And there's a lot of new build, so lots of those types of purchasers will be purchasing sort of newer properties often. Clearly, places like Peterborough or I don't know, Milton Keynes, or maybe you've got quite a few sort of, even round here, I don't know, Corby even, or some of the other Swindon, and in the West Country there's a lot more. A lot of those towns are within this sort of 1 hour, not door to door, but 1 hour travel distance of sort of the local mainline station and say King's Cross or Euston or St Pancras or whatever. Clearly the big thing here is the cost of the season ticket. The cost of the season ticket for Peterborough could be £7,000, £8,000, which is significant. You may have a 45-50 minute commute from Peterborough. You may have a 45-50 minute commute in from Surrey from some stations, but of course the season ticket may be half price. So you have to take that into account, and that's not really mentioned very much. It's quite important. But I think increasingly land values are much lower outside of the M25, and this will continue to precipitate, especially with sort of stamp duty where it is, issues in terms of the rental market and there being less availability for rental properties. Those wanting to rent are going to have a tougher time within the city, so lots of those are moving out as well because they're getting cheaper rent. So I think it's something that's been happening for a while. There's quite a long runway here. It's just going to continue, and you're just going to see more and more of that until values come closer together over time.
Dan, so 23% of Londoners want to move outside of the capital. Do you think that's going to drive, further a bubble in London? Is that going to, if all these people actually do move out of London, how sustainable are the house prices to stay there?
Yeah, I mean, I live in South East London, or just outside South East London, and close to sort of Ebbsfleet, which is an international station. It's 17 minutes into London from there. They're slowly building a lot more houses around there. Some big developments going on down there, and more. I mean, they're getting snapped up pretty much straight away. So in answer to the question of is it going to be sustainable in London, I mean, only time will tell really, but it depends on you as a person and your lifestyle and what your choices are and if you can afford to live there really. it's just getting it just as expensive closer to the M25 as it is into London now. I mean, Dartford, I don't think it'd be long before. I mean, I know Dartford are one of the top 10 places here to commute from, but they won't be long before that's a London borough, I wouldn't have thought.
No, I shouldn't think so.
Because Bexley's gone that way, Bromley's gone that way, and that's all kind of within the M25.
Yeah.
Dartford does encroach just outside, but yeah, I think it's an interesting time. Gravesend as well. I mean, there's just not enough housing stock around there, but they've got 25 minutes into London on a high speed, so it's a good commutable area, but it's not always lots of. There's not a lot of stock down there, especially as Mark was saying. Like if you want to rent, rental stock is very low.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Michael. Have you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, so looking at it from a rental perspective, I suppose, from how to put this nicely, from a mid-20s perspective, and thinking about it from where we are. So, but myself and my wife, we rent. Now we pay £900 a month for a 5-bed detached house, which is just near Grantham. Now, if we were to go to London, that £900 would get us a shoebox flat potentially, let's say. So to get from Grantham into London is about an hour, give or take a couple of minutes. So if you look at it from that perspective, let's say we take the annual ticket into account, our cost of living there, the difference would be £700-800 a month, let's say, for that annual ticket, added onto our rent. So let's say the cost of living near Grantham is £1,600-1,700, 18 if you want to sort of go top end. Now, to get something the same size in London, it's a massive difference. I suppose what we'd have to think about from our perspective, if we were to work in London, is do we take the extra expense but come home to a nice big place to live, or do you take the slightly lower price, potentially closer to work, potentially, because to be fair, to commute across London probably takes about as long as it does anyway. Yeah, I suppose the difficulty is it if you pay the lower price, you're going back to a shoebox flat. Yeah, it can be trying, to say the least, when you're living that close to each other. So that would be my opinion. Is, like Dan said earlier, it's a lifestyle choice, I think, more than anything else, as to whether you want the big open fields of Lincolnshire or whether you want skyscrapers and whatnot around you. And I think
Everything around you.
You've got to weigh that.
Distance.
Yeah. I mean, we can't. There's not a takeaway anywhere near us, so it's we don't have Deliveroo yet.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, second story we want to talk about is a story from This Is Money, which is that there's been a fall in accidental landlords for the first time in 5 years. So, an accidental landlord, obviously that's someone who has fallen into having a buy-to-let property unintentionally. It might mean that they bought a second home or they inherited a property. This article, which there'll be a link to in the description, posits a bunch of theories around why that is. Mark, what do you think about this fall in accidental landlords? It also links to a drop in the overall percentage of rentals in the market from 8.6% to 7.1% of the market is rentals. Is that anything to do with that? Do you think they're linked at all?
I think it's inevitable. I think the media has sort of precipitated and amplified this attack on landlords. Clearly the government have changed the tax backdrop in quite a few areas. So the first thing is, if you owned your own home, there was a stepped sort of capital gains tax treatment, so that I think it was over 7 years. It depends, sort of how many years you'd been in it and rented it afterwards, as to what percentage of the full sort of capital gains tax calculation you would pay. Well, that's been reduced a lot and is now sort of inferior to what it was. CGT, or capital gains tax on residential properties, has remained at 28%, whereas capital gains tax on other asset sales, such as equities or bonds or other investment classes, are now 20%, or if you're a low rate taxpayer, it's 10 or 18 if it's a residential property. So clearly there's a disadvantage there. So if you're coming out of your own home, you kind of think to yourself, well, maybe I'd better sell and put the money into another asset, because I'll only pay 20% capital gains instead of 28 potentially. In addition to that, any rent that is taken in if you're a lower rate taxpayer, potentially can be offset against the mortgage interest for income tax purposes. However, if you're nearly a higher rate taxpayer or are a higher rate taxpayer, because this will probably push you into higher rate tax, only around half of the rental income that you take from renting the property out can be offset against mortgage interest when it comes to paying your income tax. So that's quite a big shift, and it's going to, well, it has affected lots of people, and not everyone knows about it, but they sort of know it's a bad thing, so more people are inclined to sell. And I'm not finished there. The final sort of disadvantage in not selling your previous PPR would be that when you purchase your new home, you'll have a 3% surcharge on the stamp duty. So if you were paying, 2 or 3% stamp duty, you will now have 3% on top of that, which is 5 or 6%. If you sell your own home within 3 years, you can usually claim that back, but clearly there's a cash flow issue there. People have to find the money and then claim it back. Some may be nervous about qualifying and HMRC actually paying the money back, so they may want to sell their home and do a sort of exchange and completion on the same day, like most sales. That's the format that it would normally take, so that they're not subject to the 3% surcharge. So there's all that sort of taxation backdrop, which can be managed if you're a long-term investor. You start buying a limited company, that gets around the mortgage interest thing. The stamp duty, well, if you're a long-term investor, probably doesn't make that much difference. Capital gains tax, well, that doesn't apply in limited companies anyway, it's corporation tax. So for the long-term investor, you can deal with it all. But I think for the accidental landlord, it is amplified and worse. And lots of them, by the very nature that they're accidental and they're not sort of a professional property investor, they don't necessarily know some of the ways around these things, and therefore they're scared off doing it by generic media stories.
So, as a professional landlord, do you think this actually is a benefit for people like you? Because this is going to cut out those people from the market who might be the kind of people that give buy-to-let a bad name, that are also having stock on the market that could be purchased by you guys. Is this a net benefit to you in the long term?
I think it is a net benefit, and it's a net negative to tenants because what this creates is less supply, less rental stock, less rental property stock in the marketplace, less supply, therefore rents tend to rise, and that's what's happening nationally. So we are, as landlords, we are competing with less rental properties, and there are more tenants for less properties. So therefore we get more rent. It's not a negative thing for professional investors. We also have a letting agency, and clearly it's not great for the letting agency because we are seeing some of those accidental landlords that we've had selling up, or less of them coming in. So I wear a few hats, but as an investor, it's probably pretty positive for us. Yeah.
So do you think there's Dan, an element where obviously there's actually less landlords in the market now? Is that you've got the risk of people dominating certain areas, which can also control prices?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going on what Mark's saying. Really, the rents, it is a positive for investors, definitely, but also where the government have changed all the taxes we've just been saying, it's not as easy to make a single let, for example, stack up where I am in the southeast. It's quite difficult. You have to be a bit more creative and actually create multiple dwellings or do conversions and make it work that way to pull money out. And so the odd single let for an accidental landlord in our area probably isn't as much of a positive unless you can do something creative with it, maybe an HMO or do something like that.
And that then takes more homes that would be like traditional family
just
homes
for a family home, etc. So it's kind of like a double. It's good and it's bad, as I agree with Mark. Can you just go back on that, what you were saying, Mark, with if an accident, I don't really know much about that side of it. So if an accidental landlord, so someone passes away in the family, they get given the property, it's unencumbered, and they rather than and they want to keep it. If they then want to buy another home, they got to pay 3% on that principal prime residence. Did you say?
Yeah. So if they've it depends if they've got their own home currently.
So if they've already got their own home and
Yeah.
they want to buy another home, but
Yeah.
they've got this obviously property in the background as well, they don't.
So they've got 2 and they're getting 3 properties.
Yeah, they're going to get
and
another one.
They already live in one.
So they wouldn't necessarily, if they were just moving straight move, i.e. Not live there anymore and live just there, so they still end up with 2. I wouldn't have thought that's 3% because it's just principal prime residence, right? But if they wanted to keep the third property as well, then I suppose it would.
So they live in property A.
Yeah.
They get gifted property
B. Yeah.
And then they want to move from A to B.
No, A to C.
So then
there's 3 properties.
Right. Okay. And the third one has come from.
Would it depend on whether they want to keep A?
Yeah.
And move into C, and obviously B's the inherited property, if you like.
Yeah.
Or so would they pay 3% on that because they want to keep this one as another property, as a rental property? So it would be 3% on that. But if they sold A to move into C,
if they did it on the same day, then
there's no additional.
Well, no. Yeah. If they did it on the same day, potentially there's no 3% to pay. But if they didn't do it on the same day, they pay the 3% and then they claim it back.
Okay, cool.
I think this proves that it obviously is complex, and for someone who's inherited a property or
talking to accountants, they don't seem. Solicitors don't seem.
It's going to become a lot less, like you say, viable or see a straightforward path to keeping that property.
Yeah. So if you need stamp duty advice, most solicitors do not understand this, and most accountants don't either. If you go on the HMRC website and go into the stamp duty area, that there are specific examples and scenarios of people who have, bought properties and then sold them, and you can usually. I do a stamp duty section in the Telegraph where we get these questions, and they're usually answered on that HMRC stamp duty.
I mean, the reason why I ask is because we were at a network meeting the other night, and someone had brought up a case law where someone was buying a property, but they were demolishing the property because it wasn't habitable, it was like damaged or whatever, and they actually they didn't have to pay the additional 3% because it was deemed.
They claimed it back.
Yeah, they claimed it back, and it's now part of case law apparently.
Yeah,
so it's
that is, you can do that.
Yeah,
but usually subsequently, because the solicitor usually often won't put the transaction through because they don't understand that is allowed.
Right.
And prior to a few months ago, there was no case law to allow that to happen.
It's only recent,
that's subsequently changed, and HMRC have been defeated on that.
Yeah, it's quite an interesting one.
Michael, you deal with obviously finance and putting these kind of deals together. Do you see any effect on you and the people you work with these kind of regulations that are constantly evolving and changing? How hard is it for you to keep up with that kind of stuff?
So from our perspective, I mean, we don't deal with buy-to-let, so we're more the commercial side. So actually where we're seeing the benefit is at the moment a lot of my clients are buying up big portfolios from landlords who haven't been educated in the right way, who haven't received the right advice, so are now, at this point, getting hit with tax changes that actually, in theory, had they been educated in the right way and had built their property businesses in the right way, could have avoided it. So are now having to sell their portfolios for potentially sometimes quite big discounts in order to get out of this as quickly as possible. So for us, I mean, it's brilliant for business in the sense of we're getting a lot of clients who are building massive portfolios very quickly.
What are they doing with that portfolio? They're going to keep it to rent for the rental market?
Yeah, a lot of them are keeping it to rent. But because they've built their property businesses in the right way...
Stock's staying there.
Oh, it's staying as rental, yeah. They're not doing anything particularly sort of savvy with it. It's literally bring it in, put it straight back into the rental market. That's what we're seeing. We're just seeing a lot of people starting to buy up these portfolios from distressed landlords. I think it's, like these guys have already said, it's very important to get the right advice and very early on educate yourself as to how to not be an accidental landlord. I know it's unavoidable at times if you're gifted through probate and you've never wanted to be a landlord, then it's difficult. But I think it's something that should always be in the back of people's minds as to how to push themselves forward if they are in that position. And we had it yesterday. We went to go and look at a property. for rent because we were looking to move house, and actually the guy was an accidental landlord. And yeah, it was quite interesting having a discussion with him. I mean, he had no idea what was going on. So it was good to have that discussion and understand from his side, he needs to get into this as quickly as possible and get the right structure.
It's a great tip from Mark going straight to the HMRC website, because it's interesting that you've got all these professionals and half of them don't know what.
It's not their specialist area, so it's pointless asking most solicitors about this stuff. And,
it's interesting.
Yeah. So, but overall,
but that's good, because then when you find, the correct treatment, you just print it off with HMRC at the top, and then send them the link, and then almost universally they'll just accept it.
It's like a tick box exercise.
Yeah, that's it. It's done.
Yeah, that's a good tip.
But yeah, so there certainly are opportunities for investors here.
Definitely.
Because they know the right way of doing things. Awesome. So our third and final story today is we've got a story here from, I believe it's the BBC. Someone talking about the freehold of their home isn't worth the paper it's written on. So there's been quite a lot of controversy and news over the last couple of years starting to come out from especially the big new build developments where there's these strict or complex freehold and leasehold deals that are preventing people, people getting don't own the land their house is on, but they own the house, and they're having to pay thousands of pounds to have a license to build a fence. What do you guys, Mark, first of all, think of this? Do you think this is, again, another thing that makes landlords look worse? Do you think there is credit to this, or is this just a case of people not understanding the agreements they're entering into?
Well, I don't see why this is landlords' fault. It would clearly this is developers and usually the volume builders. Persimmon, Barrett. Those sorts of Barclay Homes. Those sorts of groups. And what they're doing, as land values have risen and they're under pressure from shareholders, they're finding more and more ways to eke value from their developments. So they started with the leasehold, or they were doing leasehold houses, which clearly have to be extended. You have to pay, fees to extend these leases. And the worst, most sort of insidious type of lease involved ground rents, which doubled every 10 years. Now, if ground rents double every 10 years, in, say, 30 years' time, you had people that were going to be paying 15,000, 20,000 a year in ground rent, making their property worthless. Now, there is some responsibility here that the purchaser and their solicitor have. Clearly the solicitor should be advising the purchaser as to the terms of the lease. They are legally required to do that. And if they've done that and they've written a letter and they've explained the consequences thoroughly, then people do need to take some responsibility. It always seems to be, the fault of the vendor or the big group or whatever. But clearly, if they've received legal advice, then the other side of this is they have paid a price for the property which takes those factors into account. So they've potentially paid less for the building than the market value if it wasn't leasehold or those restrictive covenants didn't apply. So that's sort of the lease side. Should leasehold houses be banned? Probably. It probably is unnecessary, and people are bound to be sort of entering into things that they don't necessarily understand. Where it comes to flats, clearly carving them up and having a situation where you've got a freeholder and a series of leaseholders has proven over time to be the best way to get agreement and get people to actually pay in to maintain the building and for somebody to take charge. There are some other, methods or structures which the government have been trying to promote, common hold, which hasn't really taken off at all. So leasehold is still there.
Common hold?
Well, it's just a different way of owning each flat that is not on a lease. It's more akin to freehold, but that's carved up between all the owners. So leasehold has, sort of proven to be a good structure. The issue, again, has come about because ground rents have been set. Now, say there's 150, 200, 250 might be common on a new build flat, which clearly should reduce the purchase price of the flat somewhat, and it does. So of course, people tend to forget the fact that the purchasers have
had a benefit of
benefited
upfront,
from the fact that they bought a flat for less than it would have been potentially. But the issue has come that some of those ground rents then double every 10 years, which I don't think new leases have been issued with those clauses in more recent times. Some of the lenders like Nationwide have said we're only going to accept new mortgages on flats where the ground rent is 1% or less of the value or the mortgage. So, I think this practice has sort of slowed down. The government said they're going to legislate, they're going to ban leasehold houses, and they say they're going to set the ground rents at 0 on flats. However, in the Queen's speech on Monday, there was absolutely no mention of any of this, and nothing about banning the Section 21 or any new sort of other changes. Maybe they're too concerned with Brexit and they haven't got time. So these changes are a long way down the road, I think, if they come at all. Back to the case you were talking about, specifically with the lady who actually has a freehold house. You wouldn't get ground rent with a freehold house, but what's happened here is she has a series of restrictive covenants on the title of her freehold home, which stops her doing all sorts of things. Might be, I don't know, putting a satellite dish up, might be putting an extension on the back,
and she has to pay every time she wants to do one of those.
This is it. So
she's
an extortionate amount.
By purchasing it, she's waived her permitted development rights, effectively. That's part of the covenant, I think, from what I've made out.
Well, a permitted development right still exists because that's a planning matter.
Yeah.
So they're still there, but these are legal restrictive covenants which require the consent of the covenantee. So effectively, that means money usually. So in terms of planning and the council's concerned, she could use her permitted development rights, put an extension on. Council will be happy as long as but she may then have a separate legal case with the covenant holder, who would then, require money or whatever, and it's done under the guise of protecting the, surrounding area or the street or neighbours or whatever. Really, it's usually just about money. Yeah, and it reduces the value of the freehold, and they'll probably, I don't know, maybe they'll package these covenants up and sell them on, a bit like with a block of flats where you sell the freehold. There's a value there, isn't there?
I've seen some stories where people have been under the impression they will be offered their leasehold before it gets when it ends, and then it's been sold on before it's ever been offered to them to development companies. Which is obviously an issue in itself.
I've done that. I've sold freeholds before I finished them, and not always, I've tried to sell them to the right people, but they've then, one of them sold them on the same day. I didn't even know they were doing it, and they put a management company in there, and they were trying to charge every time the landlords that owned the flats tried to rent them out. They tried to charge them £250 to rent the flat out. They weren't even allowed to do it in the lease, but they just send the invoices out. It's insidious. It's not.
I think it's another education issue, though, isn't it? People. Again, they're assuming buying a house is the same process everywhere. I buy the house, I own the land it's on, I can do what I want, and that's not the case. Clearly not the case.
But as Mark's saying, they need to be taking some responsibility with the people they're employing to buy the property.
It's kind of a combination of predatory practices and people not taking personal responsibility, leading to this kind of problem.
Yeah, I mean the problem is, I'm ex-conveyancer, so for me this is sort of standard, but. The thing with restricted covenants is they're entered into the TR1 at the point, which is your transfer, at the point that you purchase a property, presuming that there's no restricted covenants previous to purchasing. Now, the thing is with this one is her solicitor would have received a draft TR1. It would have had these restricted covenants clear as day in there for her to accept or negotiate. Now, there's no reason why you can't, at the point that those restricted covenants are sent over, actually negotiate them out or refuse any. Recently, my grandparents bought a property where there was a plot of land at the back. There was about 12 restrictive covenants. We negotiated them all out because actually they don't need to be there as long as they weren't there, obviously, on previous purchases or anything like that, as long as they're not from historical conveyances. So I think some of this has got to be down to the solicitor.
Sloppy conveyancing.
Yeah.
And
that's probably the best description.
Using the developer's solicitor to represent the purchaser.
Yeah, which is a predatory practice of some developers, which is you've got to use our mortgage broker, you've got to use our solicitor, and it's
don't
rubbish.
do it. Use your own solicitor. And fees, yes.
But they tug on the emotional strings.
But the problem is 3 years later they're tugging on the emotional heartstrings anyway, because you're stuck in a deal that you can't get out of.
And you can go to a conveyancing factory and get very low fees, which looks good up front, but
this doesn't get picked up.
But you're often dealing with someone who's not particularly experienced, usually not a solicitor, they're just a licensed conveyancer, and this sort of stuff often gets missed.
Sometimes not even a licensed conveyancer, because I very briefly went from a family-run conveyancing office to a factory, and it was just people that had left school, left university, and it was literally tick box exercises.
Yeah.
This sort of stuff was never ever going to be picked up.
They wouldn't have the experience to know that, would they?
Yeah.
So.
And you have a stack of issues as well, because again, new builds are often, which these are predominantly aimed at first-time buyers, who again haven't got experience buying.
Things like picking up warranties and making sure building regs are all signed off. There's a lot involved in that, and I mean, if restrictive covenants aren't being picked up,
I bought my first home 3 years ago, and to start the process, I went to a mortgage advisor, and he just goes, "This is how much you can borrow. Go start offering." And my neighbours have been through the same process, and no one talks you through this stuff at that point, because for them it's a churn. They just want the volume of people
I was looking at a plot. There was a guy who was trying to sell his house, but he's got planning, so he got planning going for the land next to him. But there was so many restrictions on it, like literally the permitted development planning put in there that you cannot, you literally permitted developments doesn't exist. So if you want to build a shed, you had to go through planning. And there's all these restrictions in it. So if I hadn't read the pack and read it properly, certain people wouldn't have even picked that up, and then they would have built it and gone up, and then people would have looked at it and gone, "Oh, well, it's not great, because if I want to build an extension or put a loft conversion on, I've got to get full planning." And the light.
We should have built it, because then you could have been in a BBC article.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you very much, guys. So our topic we want to discuss now is obviously coming off of what we've talked about in these stories. We know, and it's forever hammered in, that we have a housing crisis in this country. We're not building enough homes. There isn't enough stock on the market for purchase or for rental. All of those are falling, and house prices are increasing. The traditional solution to this is build more new homes. But obviously, there's more and more availability with permit development to develop commercial to residential. What role do you guys think commercial to residential has to play in potentially being part of that solution outside of just building more new homes? Mark, do you want to start?
So, I mean, clearly there's a shortage of new dwellings, and there is lots of empty retail, probably not quite so many offices, but lots of empty nightclubs, payday sort of loan shops, and storage above these sort of retail and high street type locations. So therein is a natural fit, and there's a natural win there. So clearly the government have introduced lots of permitted development rights to enable conversions. You still need to consult with the council, but it's not in any way as detailed or as cumbersome to obtain consent to convert those buildings, which has got to be a good thing. There's also the vacant building credit, which effectively removes Section 106, affordable housing and SIL liability from developments. So you don't have these fees to pay, or basically local taxes to pay when converting an empty commercial building into residential. So that's a further help.
Is that any commercial, Mark?
Any empty commercial building that you didn't make empty. And then in addition to that, the government helps you a little bit more in that the main contractor should be charging you 5% VAT on conversion of these buildings. So you get a reduced rate of VAT. Clearly on new build it's 0 anyway, but with these you're paying 5. So, central government and some local authorities are helpful because you're meeting their housing needs and getting them closer to their target.
And do you think, obviously commercial converted to residential, city centre, are those the kind of homes people want? Is that what the market desires, or is that just what's been made available by these laws and is the easiest route to new homes?
I think it's a bit of both. I think naturally, with the high street going the way that it's going, naturally what developers are finding as the most available stock possibly at the moment is those high street shops that, especially with things going as they are at the minute, you're not going to see a lot of sort of the big retailers moving into new premises necessarily at the moment. So I think we're going to see more developers developing more of the sort of high street. Mark being an example of a developer who's developing on the high street. And I think that will become, especially within, like we said earlier, within the commuting sort of regions, I think that's going to happen. But I think we're also going to see a couple of other things happen. I think we're going to see it easier to develop hubs. I definitely see that being something that they bring in. I think land banking is going to be a big no-no pretty soon. I think they're going to possibly bring something into...
Just tell us what land banking is.
So where developers are essentially buying or taking multiple option agreements over plots of land that they have no intention of developing anytime soon. So I've got a developer who I know who's got 47 plots that he's got no intention of developing those anytime soon. He's got them on open-ended option agreements with the landowners. So I think we'll see some movement to try and force developers maybe to develop those a bit quicker. How you'd enforce that, I've got no idea.
It's hard, isn't it, as a conflict, because obviously developers only want to produce a certain number of homes.
Depends on the size of the land and everything as well, because it's the
demand
infrastructure that you've got to bring into it as well.
That's it.
So you can't just develop everything, obviously, not all at once. But
And we may see a shift to actually reduce the amount of affordable on some developments as well. Because I think that's one big thing that puts a lot of developers off.
Why do you think that is? Because it puts developers off building them?
Because purely the percentage on some developments, I mean, it can be as much as 30-35% on some developments. We've got one at the minute that actually it was 30% on a 40-unit build in Northampton, and they actually went back in and actually appealed it. I can't remember the notice that you have to serve, but they basically got the affordable removed in order to make it. It's a viability.
It's a viability report.
And they did a viability report, and actually it went to committee, and the affordable was removed, and that is now a viable development. So it's I think we'll see a few moves.
I mean, I'm not looking at stuff as big as that. I mean, most of the stuff we do is we kind of stick to that 5 to 10 unit size. Mainly 5 would be the nice, and we're looking at little conversions off the high street, just off the high street in small, what do they call it? Secondary locations. So we're looking at places like that where we can just pick things up, turn it back, get the permitted development. If we then can get planning to go up in lofts and things like that, so we can get a bit of additional value to it. But with those type of properties, in my opinion, you've got to be some sort of building background, because you need to keep the costs very, very low. You need to be very much hands-on or involved in those sort of developments. To get a main contractor on that could push the costs up too high. So it just depends on your situation and what you're coming into. But those sort of, and there's no restriction on room sizes and all that sort of in regards to the actual size of the flat. We've got one yesterday. It's just an old solicitor's, literally split in half. It's double fronted, split in half. 2 bed, 2 bed, 2 bed, and then we're going to go up in the loft and get planning for another 2 bed up in the loft. Really straightforward, pulling pulling 50 grand out the back end of it. So it's a good deal, But I'm very hands-on and very involved in it. But I've got the experience and the background to do that. So,
well, I think what we've seen today from what we've talked about is that there is a further kind of professionalisation of the landlord and investor market, which is making it harder and harder for someone just to own a second home and make a good profit on that, which might be a negative for the hobbyists, but for professionals and investors is a really good thing.
It takes the market to a better level, I think, personally. You're going to get people that are doing things properly, you're going to get decent properties people that actually care about what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Mark, have you got any final thoughts on what we talked about today?
I think there are probably more of these rights coming, and it'll be great, but Brexit has to sort of be dealt with first.
Absolutely.
I don't think a lot's going to happen until then. So anything that looks like it's coming on the horizon that they have announced might take a while, so you've got an opportunity to sort of set your sail and move in a different direction now until the legislation gets implemented, which is, you know, a bit of an advantage really.
Michael, any final thoughts on today?
No, I think we've covered most things. I think, yeah, it would just be interesting to see, like Mark said, where some of the movements are made, especially within permitted development, because they've got to address this shortage of homes. And I think, with developers land banking and not as many permitted development rights as we could probably do with, we're never going to hit where we need to hit. So it'd be interesting to see where they move with it.
It's just, I mean, I'm the same, but also just getting into more the people locally that have got those decisions to make needs to be working with people more, in my opinion, rather than fighting against them. You know, we're only trying to do things the right way and do it well, and better the town that it's in. So you know, just work with us really.
Absolutely. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, guys. Dan, just remind us again where people can find you and follow you.
Yeah, so just literally thepropertyvaultuk.com.
Okay, Michael, yourself?
Thepropertyfinanceguide.co.uk.
And Mark?
progressiveproperty.co.uk.
Great, cool. Thanks for tuning in, guys. Please remember, like and subscribe to get updates on these videos every single week. Please leave your comments below. We love to hear what you've got to say. Anything we've discussed, you're going to find in the description to this show, links, references, etc. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.